Thank you all for joining for today's research seminar of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And the purpose of these seminars is really to share and discuss our interdisciplinary research that we're doing within the Institute, but also learn from other researchers elsewhere across Monash, across Australia and also internationally. And you can find all our research seminars on our website. If you missed one in the past, feel free to go there and check some of those out. My name is Rob Raven. For those who don't know me, I'm a professor of sustainability transitions at MSDI, and I will host today's seminar. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the land where I'm based, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. So I'm very pleased that today we have our very own speaker in the seminar series, Dr. Cameron Allen. Many of you might know Cameron. He's a beloved colleague in the MSDI research team, and he's a senior research fellow there. I think you started about 3 or 4 years ago. I actually can't recall exactly. It might even be longer. But it's been a great pleasure having Cameron in the team, and you've been a very productive and collegial person to work with. Cameron is really interested in the drivers and dynamics of sustainable development transformations, which is really a core topic of what MSDI is about and what we're trying to achieve through our current strategic agenda. In particular, he's interested in the role of policy in interplay with technological, social, and political drivers, and how this interplay can then shape the speed, but also the directionality of transitions. And I think what Cameron really brings to the table is this unique combination of different kinds of methods, both qualitative and quantitative methods, including modeling complex systems, which is really great to have that on board of our team. And I think it's a really novel contribution that Cameron is making to use these kind of models then in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's also what you will be talking about today. So amongst his many accomplishments, he's been involved with Shireen also on a call here in last year's publication of the UN, the Global Sustainable Development Report, and he also regularly publishes in various nature journals, including the paper that you will present to you today. And prior to joining us, you worked for the UN in New York, and you have a PhD degree from the University of New South Wales. So before jumping into the presentation, just a few practicalities. Cameron will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, roughly around 35. Then there will be room for Q&A, and feel free to put questions in the chat, but preferably just raise your physical or digital hand and post the question yourself. So please, Cameron, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining the seminar today, where I'll be talking about sustainable development transformations. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara peoples on whose lands I'm based here in Brisbane, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So the study I'll be talking about today is really part of our research on the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. Because, why do we focus on the SDGs? Well, I think personally they provide a really powerful way to measure societal progress, which goes beyond the usual measures like GDP. It's a useful compass for governments, for business, for communities who are seeking to become more sustainable and create more sustainable societies. And I think if we can advance progress on the SDGs, then we would see improvements in well-being, inequality, the natural environment, which I think are widely acknowledged and desirable outcomes for any country. I'm just hearing a little bit of background noise, so can I just make sure everyone's got their microphones on mute? That would be great, thanks. But our studies are also important because our own assessments of Australia's progress on the SDGs shows, that we have fairly mixed performance. We perform well in areas such as education and health, but progress is really stagnated in other areas, and we're well behind sort of leading countries in areas like, environmental indicators around greenhouse gas emissions, but also in poverty and inequality. So there are areas that we can do better. And our paper that I'll talk about today is really sort of solutions focused. We're looking at, what could be done to improve Australia's progress on the SDGs and achieve some of these desirable outcomes that we all seek. So I'll be talking, as Rob mentioned, about a paper that we published this year in Nature Communications, which is on modelling 6 sustainable development transformations in Australia. But the research really builds on several years of research now that we've been doing on sustainable development transformations and on the SDGs, including the work that we did with the UN Global Sustainable Development Report. So looking at, if one wants to seek to accelerate sustainable development transformations, what could be done? What are the key impediments and enablers in transformations? And also past modelling work where we've slowly built this modelling capability over time, with our first study back in 2019, published in Nature Sustainability, where we first presented our model and some initial scenarios for Australia. And so today I'm going to touch on 5 key areas. Firstly, I'll give a general approach to the study and some headline findings. Then I'll dig a bit more into this 6 transformations pathway. I'll do a deep dive into 3 of the transformations. We don't have time today to cover all 6, so I've just picked 3 to give you a flavour of the modelling in terms of the policies and the results. Then I'll talk a bit about transformation spillovers and policy interactions, and then some final reflections. So we started this study back at the end of 2020, early 2021, where the world and Australia were in the grips of the COVID pandemic, but there are also a number of other crises at the time, what the UN refers to as the poly crisis. And we really sort of saw this as a good framing for the study, that these crises could represent a critical juncture that sort of where 2 different recovery pathways diverge for Australia. The first recovery pathway we called the Build Back the Same pathway. So this is very much a return to the status quo, and a 6 transformations pathway. And we use our modelling to project these 2 pathways through to 2030 and look at their progress, or compare their progress on the SDGs, and then also extend those projections through until 2050, where we can look at the progress on longer term sustainable development, as well as other objectives like net zero. So a bit more on the 2 pathways. I mean, each is accompanied by a meta-narrative. So the Build Back the Same pathway is very much a return to pre-COVID policies and government expenditure levels. The economic stimulus that was brought in during the COVID years ends in 2021. There's no real attention to the SDGs or any structural change. No new expenditure. The stage 3 tax cuts are introduced, and the recovery pathway is really framed around this gas-led recovery, which was, as you might recall, was the policy, the recovery pathway at that time of the previous government. So it really sees this continued political inertia around climate change. Whereas our 6 transformation pathway is really an ambitious recovery pathway, which uses the SDGs as a roadmap. So again, we sort of frame this around, these converging crises creating conditions for change. We see the government stimulus that was brought in during COVID continued, albeit in a much scaled back form, at about 7.5% of additional expenditure per annum through to 2030. We also adjust tax and revenue settings to finance this expenditure so that it's cost neutral. And this additional finance is used to fund an ambitious mix of policies, which we structure around these 6 key transformations. So, what are these transformations and why do we choose them? Well, they actually come from global research on the SDGs, which identifies 6 transformations or 6 systemic entry points that have the greatest potential to accelerate progress on the SDGs. These ones come from the Global Sustainable Development Report, which Shirin and I worked on. But there have been other frameworks put forward by researchers such as Jeffrey Sachs and Mariana Mazzucato, as well as by the global modelling community, by the UN, etc. They're all fairly similar. There are some differences. We use the ones from the GSDR as our starting point. And I think the real value is that they identify these systemic entry points that help to simplify the SDGs. So, the SDGs are very broad. They have 17 goals, 160 plus targets. And it's difficult for countries and stakeholders to know where to start with the SDGs. So this helps to simplify things a bit and identify key areas or key entry points where policy action, other actions by stakeholders can accelerate progress towards the SDGs. So how do we model the pathways? So we use what's called the ISDG Australia model. So this is sort of a helicopter view of the model, looking down on it. It's a large system dynamics model or a simulation model. So it models what if type scenarios. So if we change this policy, what would be the outcome in the future? If we change this assumption, what would be the outcome in the future for different indicators? So it's a very large model. There's over 3,000 variables that are integrated across 36 different modules. So each of those squares on the screen there represents a different module within the model. And the blue lines show all of the different links between those modules in the model. So it really builds on several decades of experience in building system dynamics models for national planning. It's originally built by the Millennium Institute, which is a think tank in the US. But it's drawn in multidisciplinary expertise from a range of different areas. So for example, the economic and finance modules were developed with economists from the World Bank. The land and food and agricultural models were developed with the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN and UNEP. Similarly, the energy and resource models were developed with the International Energy Agency and UN Environment Programme. And there's also been, many country applications with different versions of the models over the last couple of decades, which have sort of had, help with continuous improvement. And the latest model, it really tries to encompass all 17 SDGs in the modeling framework. It's really the only model that is capable of modeling all 17 goals in a single framework. So we validate the model for Australia on, a large database of time series data going back to 1990. And the model has been, rigorously peer reviewed over the years in different journals, some really key high profile journals like Nature Sustainability, Nature Communications, PNAS, etc. So a little bit more on the model for those who are interested in models like myself. It has 11 environmental and engineering system modules. So these include things like land, water, energy, materials, waste, emissions, biodiversity, etc. 10 social and demographic modules. So this includes things like population, fertility, mortality, education and health, infrastructure, employment, income distribution and poverty. And then 10 core economic and finance modules, which include agricultural, industry and services production, aggregate GDP, investment, finance, government households, etc. There's also several modules which we use to evaluate progress towards the SDGs. So these include the SDGs indicators and targets, as well as modules that we use to bring in different policies and policy settings. And overall, across the whole model, which, as I mentioned, covers all 17 goals, there's 52 different SDG targets and 80 different indicators that we're able to make projections on. So in terms of the nuts and bolts of the study, so for each of those pathways, we parameterize the model based on the policy settings and assumptions that are embedded in those pathways. And then we make projections through to 2030 to look at progress towards the SDGs. So the model essentially can project the amount of progress that's made towards a specific target. We can also look at progress towards specific goals by averaging progress across targets, and also look at average progress overall towards all 17 SDGs. So when we look at progress at the goal level for the two pathways, so this chart on the right shows the amount of progress made towards each goal by each of those two pathways. And what these results show is that the sixth transformation pathway, performs a lot better, or progress accelerates on a range of goals, including goal 1 on poverty, goal 2 on food and nutrition, goals 5 and 10 on gender and income inequality, green industry, goal 9, cities and consumption, so goals 11 and 12, climate action, goal 13, and biodiversity, goals 14 and 15, as well as governance and inclusion. In some goals, like goal 3 on health, goal 4 on education, goal 6 on water, the performance is pretty similar across the two different pathways. These are areas where Australia tends to perform well on the SDGs. And there's one goal which is a fraction behind in the 6 transformations pathway in 2030, which is on economic growth and jobs. But they were the results for 2030. When we extend those projections over the longer term to 2050, we can see that these short-term trade-offs actually become longer-term gains. This is the progress made towards SDG 8 on economic growth and jobs. We can see that that 6 transformations pathway actually performs a lot better over the longer term, despite those short-term trade-offs. And then, the overall finding, when we look at progress across all 17 goals, so this is the amount of progress that each pathway makes towards all of the goals and targets in the model. So we can see that, the build back the same or business as usual type pathway really sees progress on the SDGs and well-being stagnate and actually decline over the longer term. Whereas this sort of SDGs oriented pathway sees that progress, accelerates through to 2030 and continues to improve, with most of the goals being achieved by 2050. So what is this 6 transformations pathway? So I'll talk a bit now about the analytical framework and some of the key transformations and policies in this pathway. So this is the analytical framework which we developed for the modelling study, which includes a number of key components, which I'll go through quickly. But it's important to know that we do have, obviously the modelling, the quantitative component, but we also have, qualitative storylines and narratives that support the modelling work. So our starting point, as I mentioned, is really these 6 transformations. So these are the key entry points for action on the SDGs. We break these transformations down into 16 policy shifts. So each of those transformations has a mix of policies that we introduce into the model. These policy shifts are also supported, or each transformation is also supported by a transformation storyline. So in these storylines, we diagnose impediments to transformation and identify enabling conditions that are important for these transformations and for these key policy shifts to succeed. This is based on a broader literature review, including our previous work, looking at, the enablers and impediments of the acceleration of transformation. We have a set template that we developed for each of the transformations to develop the storyline, which essentially diagnoses different lock-ins, including techno-economic, political, institutional, social, behavioural. So these are the key lock-ins that stem from the literature on acceleration. And we also identify important enabling conditions, or explain the conditions that would be needed for these transformations to accelerate. So this includes, positive seeds of change, emerging innovations, but also these social, political, and technological enabling conditions for acceleration. So I won't be talking much about the storylines today. I'll focus more on the modelling results. But suffice to say that each transformation, the storyline differs, and the impediments and enabling conditions differ. But they're, in terms of the lock-ins, they're things like higher upfront costs of sustainable technologies, policy settings favouring market incumbents, resistance from powerful interests, so societal pushback from changes in lifestyles and practices. So these are key, lock-ins that stem again from the transformations or transitions literature. And important enabling conditions for decisive action include things like the maturation of technologies, shifts in narratives and public opinion, new coalitions and social movements, support from powerful actors, and as well as emerging and compounding crises that weaken resistance. So these all sort of feature in these transformation storylines that accompany our modelling. So the next component is the model projections themselves. So these 16 policy shifts are quantified and parameterized in the model, and we make projections then through to 2030 and 2050 and look at progress on a range of different targets. And then the final component is really looking at interactions. So We're interested in whether these transformations are mutually reinforcing. Do they support one another or do they contradict one another? And which transformations are the most important for progress on different SDGs? So just to recap, we start with the 6 transformations. They're broken down into these 16 different policy shifts, which I've put up on the screen here. I'll go into these a little bit more for a few of the transformations, but I've listed them there so you can sort of see the types of things included. And these policy shifts are then used to parameterize the model, make those projections through to 2030 and 2050, and then we evaluate the findings. Okay, so I'm going to talk now a bit about some of the policies and the projections for a few of the transformations on well-being, on the sustainable just economy and energy decarbonisation. So I'll start with the first transformation, which is on well-being and resilience. So as I mentioned, this includes a range of policies that we use to parameterize our model. This includes increased government investment in health and education, scaling up government expenditure on climate change adaptation and disaster resilience. And we also assume a more rapid decarbonisation based on our other transformations, which results in a lower global temperature and reduced climate change impacts. So one of the assumptions is that other countries are also on this decarbonisation pathway, similar to Australia. So these policies have a range of implications in terms of different SDGs, particularly SDG 3 on health, 4 on education, and 13 on climate action. And we can see some of the projections here for some of the indicators. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of different targets and indicators in the model. I've just picked a few key ones to present here, and a few things to note on these charts. Firstly, the baseline or build back the same pathway is presented with that grey dotted line. The 6 transformations pathway is the green line. The projections go from 2020 to 2050 on the screen. The pink cross shows where the SDG target is for 2030. And so the green shading that sits behind the projections, where the projections are in this green shading range, shows that they're performing better than a target. And the grey arrows that sit beside the charts just show whether it's desired to improve or to increase this particular indicator or decrease this particular indicator. So for example, if we look at life expectancy and tertiary education, we obviously want to increase those. The 6 transformation pathway performs a bit better on these indicators, but generally both pathways perform well and above target values. These are areas where Australia tends to perform well overall. Whereas looking at persons affected by disasters, our 6 transformation pathway performs a lot better in that situation or on this indicator, which is largely because of this additional investment in adaptation and disaster resilience, as well as reduced climate change impacts, which we assume in the model. So what's driving these outcomes in the model? So I've tried to sort of piece together how these different variables are related in the model and some of the key interrelationships and causal dynamics that are at play. So just starting with these 3 variables, we can see that education and years of schooling is an important driver in the model for reducing mortality rates, whereas deaths due to disasters actually increases mortality rates as it goes up. And as mortality rates go up, it reduces life expectancy overall. So the red arrows in this case show a sort of a negative relationship, and the blue arrows a positive relationship. We can, of course, start to expand that out and look at, what are the drivers for reducing mortality rates. So, for example, prevalence of undernourishment, road fatalities, violence, and air pollution are all additional.
So there was a draft interim report sent out yesterday.
Stephen, can you mute yourself, please? We can hear you.
Yep, all good. So we just want the draft. There's no expecting it to complete the report.
Sorry about this, Cameron. Let me see if I can mute Stephen. I don't think you can hear us. Seems to be, yeah, he's muted now.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. So as I mentioned, these are some of the additional drivers that increase mortality in the model. There are also drivers that that decrease mortality rates in the model. So this includes things like per capita income, access to services, health expenditure per capita, as well as years of schooling, as I mentioned. And we can then begin to start to see where these policies that we have in the wellbeing and resilience transformation start to plug into the model. So additional expenditure on education increases years of schooling. Health expenditure, as I mentioned, decreases mortality rates, and adaptation and resilience expenditure reduces the deaths due to disasters. And these all flow through mortality rates to have an impact on life expectancy. But this is sort of a fairly, I guess, a linear view of the relationships in the model. There's also many different feedbacks that create a sort of, I guess, a more complex picture. So, for example, per capita income also has an impact on years of schooling. Years of schooling also has an impact on road fatalities, which then flows through to life expectancy. And we can also begin to see some circular feedbacks in the model, for example, where life expectancy also is a driver of productivity. Productivity can flow through to per capita income to years of schooling to mortality, and back to life expectancy. So we have these circular feedbacks or reinforcing feedbacks in the model, which drive particular outcomes. Others would include where, per capita income increases, which also increases government revenue, which provides more revenue available for different policy expenditure, again flowing through to these different variables and life expectancy. So there's many different feedbacks in the model. We can also then start to see, if we look at these 5 other transformations, where do they, what impact do they have on this wellbeing and resilience transformation and the key indicators that we were looking at? So, for example, down on the bottom right there in yellow, if we look at energy decarbonisation, so that accelerates the transition to net zero, which reduces climate change impacts and deaths due to disasters, which again flows through to life expectancy. If we have a look at sustainable and just economy transformation in orange there on the right, so this includes different interventions such as infrastructure investment, female participation in the labour force. These drive productivity improvements, which again flows through to per capita income and eventually to life expectancy. Similarly, if we look over on the left here at food and nutrition and urban development, these also have key entry points into these different variables and impact life expectancy. So I guess the key point here is that these transformations actually have spillover effects on one another, which can be, reinforcing or contradicting in some cases. For example, the additional tax settings in the sustainable and just economy can actually reduce per capita income. So that has a constraining effect. So this is just a taste, I guess, of some of the complex feedbacks in the model. I guess a key strength of a model like this is that it simulates these complex feedbacks, which are often too complex for the human mind to comprehend. And it simulates the cumulative outcomes for the SDGs. So you have these synergies and trade-offs, these positive and negative interactions, which play out in the model and influence the progress towards the SDGs. And as I mentioned, we can see, in the image here, in this helicopter view of the model, all of these blue arrows between the different modules are actually live links in the model. So you can see the complexity of these interrelationships. Okay, so moving on to the next transformation. This is on sustainable and just economy. So this includes policies on 2 key topics, on a sustainable economy and on a just economy. So in terms of the sustainable economy, so this includes additional investment in green manufacturing, reduced industry material consumption, increased infrastructure investment, which has a range of implications in the model, but particularly for SDG 9 on sustainable industry and SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production. So looking now at some of the projections, firstly for material footprint up on the top right there. So for this indicator, we can see that, the sixth transformations pathway performs better, but neither pathway really comes close to that target value for this indicator. So this is really one of the indicators that would be very difficult for Australia to achieve. It's a measure of the consumption of resources in an economy. Whereas if we look down at manufacturing share of GDP, which is another SDG indicator, again, neither pathway achieves that target by 2030, but the Sustainable Transformations pathway really turns things around by 2050 and comes close to achieving the target value. Whereas under our Build Back the Same pathway, the situation continues to decline. And finally, looking at CO2 emissions per unit value add, again, the sixth transformation pathway here can see achieving that target and continuing to make gains over time to 2050. So again, we can sort of try to unpack some of these interactions in the model, the relationships between these three particular variables. So obviously manufacturing is a key component of GDP and GDP growth. So GDP growth is a driver of resource consumption, including from biomass, non-metallic resources, metal ores, and fossil fuels. So these are really the key components of material footprint, whereas fossil fuel consumption also drives CO2 emissions. And again, if we look at the policy mix for this particular transformation, we can see where it starts to plug into these different variables in the model. So increased investment in manufacturing and infrastructure, obviously improved manufacturing as well as GDP growth, which can drive increased resource consumption. Our resource efficiency targets tend to balance that. They have an impact on productivity and GDP growth, but also they reduce consumption of resources from the industry sector, which has a range of feedbacks in the model. Okay, so moving on to our just economy component. So the just economy includes a range of policies, which include government expenditure on social transfers, abandoning the stage 3 tax cuts, additional taxes on trade, income and profits and consumption, as well as increased female participation in the workforce. So this has a range of implications again for the SDGs, but particularly SDG 1 on poverty, SDG 5 on gender, SDG 8 on economic growth, and SDG 10 on inequality. So again, this is some of the projections for some key indicators in the model. So we can see our sixth transformation pathway has a significant improvement on poverty rate in the top right corner there. It doesn't quite achieve the target by 2030, but it does over the longer term to 2050. Similarly, on the Gini coefficient, the projection is much improved for our sixth transformations pathway. Whereas if we look at per capita disposable income, we see a decrease in this under the sixth transformations pathway in the short term, which is largely due to the changes in tax settings, but an improvement over the longer term where it actually exceeds the Build Back the Same pathway. And finally, just quickly on the energy decarbonisation transformation. So this includes a range of different policies. Again, the accelerated phase out of fossil fuel generators and rapid transition to 100% renewables, increased energy efficiency in industry, industry electrification and fuel switching, and reducing other industry emissions. So this has implications for Goal 7 on energy, as well as Goal 13 on climate action. So looking at some of the projections here, we see that acceleration in renewable electricity, which reaches close to 100% by 2050. The renewable share in total final energy consumption also increases over time and is pretty close to meeting the target value, and primary energy intensity also declines rapidly over time. So in the case of Goal 7, the targets are more or less met with the sixth transformation pathway, but the Build Back the Same pathway is really underperforming. And just finally, across the six transformations, there's a range of different measures for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for accelerating the transition to net zero. The model also projects overall greenhouse gas emissions from a range of different sectors. So this just breaks it down by sector, but I guess the key message here is that, greenhouse gas emissions reduce significantly over time through to 2050. And if we bring in carbon offsets as well, through increased investment in reforestation, then we see a net zero outcome over the longer term. So the 6 transformations are, accelerate progress on the SDGs, but also achieve a net zero outcome over the longer term. So I'll talk a bit now just about these policy interactions or spillover effects, both between the different transformations, as well as, which transformations have the biggest impact on specific SDGs. So each of the transformations, as I sort of tried to unpack a bit before in those causal diagrams, has an impact on one another. So increasing well-being and resilience can also have sort of reinforcing impacts for a range of other transformations, or constraining impacts on other transformations. And through our modelling results, we're able to sort of unpack and decompose these effects. Firstly, by modelling each of these transformations individually, and then modelling them at an aggregate level, we're able to decompose those. So this alluvial flowchart presents, the beneficial spillover effects from one transformation to another. So it's the amount of progress that one transformation makes, or beneficial progress that it makes towards other transformations. So in case of well-being at the top there in light blue, we can see that it has beneficial spillover effects for most of the other transformations. And a couple of key insights from this are really that this well-being and resilience transformation, as well as the energy decarbonisation transformation, have the largest positive sort of reinforcing spillover effects for other transformations. So these could be, if one wanted to sequence policies, these could be priority areas where initial action could help drive or create the conditions for transformation in other areas. It also shows that the largest receivers of these positive spillovers are the sustainable and just economy and the natural environment. And you can see there, particularly in the natural environment, these positive spillovers come from the food systems transformation, the energy decarbonised transformation, the urban systems transformation. So these transformations really drive a better outcome for the environment. So we can also unpack the relationship between the 6 transformations and each of the 17 SDGs. So this chart essentially shows the progress made towards each of the 17 goals. So we can see them listed on the right there, from SDG 1 on poverty at the bottom through to SDG 17 at the top. The grey component of the bars just show the amount of progress made under the baseline scenario. And then the coloured bars show the amount of additional progress that's made on each goal as a result of the different transformations. And the colours are sort of coded to each transformation on the left there. So from this, we can see that, looking at the light blue segments in those bars, we can see that the well-being and resilience transformation really has a positive impact on most goals, particularly on poverty, economy, cities, climate action, but mainly through these resilience provisions in the or resilience investment in that transformation. For the sustainable and just economy, which is the orange segments there, the benefits are concentrated in goals on poverty, gender and income inequality. For sustainable food systems, the benefits are in the dark blue bars are really concentrated on food and nutrition and land biodiversity and climate. Energy decarbonisation in the yellow segments improves progress on many goals, so on poverty, energy, economy, industry, cities, climate action, etc. So I guess the key insight here is that we can start to look at, which transformations are driving which particular outcomes in the model as a result of all of these complex feedbacks, both the synergies and the trade-offs that are sort of embedded in these complex feedbacks. So for those who are interested in modelling, we also undertake sensitivity analysis on the modelling results. So obviously model results are very uncertain and they're subject to deep uncertainty in the future. So we're able to evaluate the effects of changes in global circumstances or national circumstances in Australia to look at how sensitive our model results are to these changes. So they might be higher, climate change impacts than expected, or higher costs from climate change. There might be, significant reductions in trade and global demand. There might be political instability or different governance factors. And in the model, we can change all of these factors simultaneously and produce a range or sort of a confidence interval for the projections. But I guess the key insights here are really that, a more hostile global and national outlook would wipe off some of the gains from that 6 transformations pathway, but certainly not all of them. So it shows that the pathway is, reasonably robust to changes in circumstances. So that is sort of evident on the chart on the left, which shows that confidence intervals or the range of those projections. And the chart on the right with the box plots, the wider these plots are, just shows which goals are more sensitive to these changes in drivers. So this highlights that, goals on poverty, the economy, food, health, cities, and social cohesion are the most sensitive to these global shocks. So I'll just touch on now just a few final reflections. So I guess, overall, the modelling results show that Australia could accelerate progress on the SDGs by 2030 and largely achieve the goals by 2050, along with a net zero outcome. There are some short-term trade-offs, but these actually, see significant gains over the longer term, which balance out these trade-offs. Government policy is obviously a key lever for accelerating progress. And the 6 transformations framework that we use provides, a simple framework for, which can guide action, which can simplify action. But it's also important to note that, the ambitious policy action that we assume in the modelling will not happen without broader social, political, and technological enabling conditions. We talk about these in our transformation storylines in a qualitative way, but they're not endogenized. They're not endogenized in the model, so they're not quantified in the model. So the key driver of change in the model is really these different assumptions and policy settings. And look, in terms of our research moving forward, so we are looking at using the modelling results in the next Transforming Australia assessment. So this is an assessment that MSDI leads on Australia's progress towards the SDGs. We've traditionally looked at, Australia's historic performance and time series data. In the next assessment, we'll be complementing that with some of our modelling results, sort of looking forward at what could be done to accelerate progress on the SDGs. But in terms of our future research, I'm very interested in developing new methods for endogenizing some of these broader technological, social, political drivers that enable or constrain transformations. So merging systems modelling with socio-technical transitions research. And this is the topic of the DECRA that I submitted last year. I'm also, as part of that, interested in looking, bringing some more realism into these pathways by looking at, the work that's been done on socio-technical pathways, socio-technical scenarios, which include, this reconfiguration pathway, technological substitution type pathways. Again, that's part of my proposed DECRA. We're also interested in post-growth pathways, so modelling some of the key post-growth policies that have been put forward by that community and the key structural changes associated with that, and looking at what the implications would be, both positive and negative for the SDGs and net zero. And this is part of ARC Discovery project that we've submitted recently. And, as part of both of these projects, really looking at what additional innovations and more radical innovations can we bring into the modelling work, sort of associated with, sufficiency objectives, including mode shifting, major changes in diets, sharing economy, circular economy, etc. So this would complement, I think, some of the, the technological innovations with other social innovations that would be great to be able to bring into the modelling. So just to finish up, this is the study again. If you want to read more about it, you can find it. It's open access on Nature Communications. And I'd like to also give a shout out to my co-authors, to Annabelle, Tommy from UNSW, to Matteo Pedicini from the Millennium Institute, and Shirin Malikpour from MSDI. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Cameron. That was a great, excellent presentation. I'm going to open up the floor for questions, given that we've got about 15 minutes left and we already have a few raised hands. So Anki, I think you were the first, so go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Cameron. Really great presentation. It's great to see kind of looking at different policy inputs together and then also different goals. Too often we just have one goal in mind and then can't really see what the impact on other goals might be. The question I have relates to the extent to which you can actually look at very specific policies. So for example, when you think about climate policy, you know, adding 1.1% of GDP to the climate policy goals, it depends very much what specific policy you're thinking of. An ERF might be much less efficient in achieving those goals than, say, an emissions trading scheme or something like that. So to what extent can you actually look at very specific policies within your modeling framework?
Thanks, Anki, for the question. I guess, you know, it really varies across different sectors, depending on the level of detail, but it is quite aggregated, and generally a lot of the policies in the model are sort of expenditure or investment driven. So we take government expenditure data, and then we're able to make adjustments to that expenditure data and look at the impacts of that. That said, you know, it would be, you know, it's a highly adaptable and flexible model. So if we're interested in looking at a specific policy measure, then we can develop the structure for that in the model, you know, based on other modeling, based on the research literature, and based on input from experts. So there's a lot of opportunities there to look at specific policies, but generally it's fairly high level, introduction of these effects.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. Over to you, Tony.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cameron. Excellent presentation. You covered a lot of territory there. I thought it was a very good presentation, quite succinct considering the ground you covered. My question is about the reception that you've had to the work in the Australian policy community. You know, certainly since the SDGs were agreed across the nations of the world, much of the attention to them in Australia has been from our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, whereas clearly in this work you're very focused on the important domestic context as well. And we are at a point with the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, who is striving to measure what matters in an Australian policy context. I just wonder what reception you've had to this point and whether you see opportunities there. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Tony. So we've done a couple of SDG focused modelling studies now. And I guess I'd say a few things. Firstly, I mean, the SDGs, there's very little traction with them with the federal government in Australia. This is obviously national scale modelling. And so they're a key target audience. They're obviously not that interested in SDGs, but there are, you know, the changing government has seen an uptick in interest in the well-being, measuring what matters, which is very closely linked to the SDGs, I think. So, you know, there's potential there to sort of frame the modelling in different ways, sort of make it less SDG centric, to focus more on well-being, and I think that's what the approach we'll take in the Transforming Australia. And so I'm hoping that that will be a conduit to raise interest in the work more broadly. Because at the moment it is a research study. It's really blue sky research that's developing and building methods and capabilities for studying these things, for modelling these things. I've been contacted by the government to do some modelling work in other related areas, but not on the SDGs. So the modelling has sparked interest in terms of work that's been done on closing the gap, for example. So we were commissioned to build a specific model to evaluate or make scenario projections for the closing the gap targets. And that was, essentially a smaller model, but drew heavily on the same model that we've used for Australia for the SDGs. So we took some of the modules, mainly more the socioeconomic modules, and we're able to build a tool on that. There's been interest in government from the Department of Industry and Science as well, which has contacted us to see whether the model can be used for modelling social cohesion. So they have a sort of responsibility for looking at the impacts of critical technologies and what the implications are for Australia. And they have different criteria for that: economic prosperity, national security, and social cohesion. And social cohesion is one area that they're not really able to model yet. So that's another potential area. I've also been contacted by different state governments, so in Victoria and in Tasmania, to see whether the modelling can be used for different purposes. In Victoria, more on their environmental reporting; in Tasmania, on their population strategy. So the model, has lots of different potential applications, but I think there's probably not really a great amount of awareness. These contacts have largely come because people have read our journal papers. I'd really like to see it become, used in the Transforming Australia assessment, and that sort of then creates a bit more publicity and hopefully awareness of what capability we have.
Thanks very much, Cameron.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Cameron. And we've got a question from Steve Johnson.
Hi, yeah, just wanted to ask, you mentioned the closing the gap and the work that you're doing around that. And just wondering to what extent there is a role within all of these transformations for what have been referred to as the post-development alternatives that have sort of cropped up around the world. So I guess Indigenous knowledges would be part of that, and sort of a host of other more radical kind of approaches. And just wondering if you saw that there was any role for those in the work that you're doing.
Well, thanks, Steve. That's a good question. I mean, that does come into our transformation storylines and our narratives to some degree. It's not something that we capture yet in the modelling. But yeah, as I mentioned, we sort of want to look at these more radical approaches and post-growth kind of scenarios and pathways, and I think that would certainly feature as a key, a key factor in these alternative visions. It's not something we focused on in the current study, which is looking at SDGs, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely scope to do that. It's just a matter of resource and time. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve and Cameron. We don't have another question at the moment. I'll ask a question myself, if that's okay, and others might think of another one if they have a final question. I was wondering about the role of basically actors and their interests, etc., in the model. You don't really talk about actors, and maybe that's more in sort of the narratives underpinning them. But my question is, does everyone win under these pathways and scenarios, or are there also losers? And if that's the case, who are they, and what might that tell us about the social political willingness to actually implement these scenarios?
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob. So in terms of actors, yeah, they're factored in at a very aggregate level in the modelling itself. Certainly in the pathways, it looks at the importance of different actors in building the conditions for policy action. The modelling itself obviously includes government, includes households, includes business investment, but only really in a monetary sense and an economic sense. So households are represented in terms of their income and consumption, etc. So we can look at impacts in the model on households, but only so far as it affects these sorts of indicators that we have embedded in the model. So we can look at the beneficial or the effects or trade-offs in those variables, but not in others. So it would be challenging to bring in sort of more depth in actors in the model. It's something I think when we look at these social political dynamics that we'll have to consider in how we bring in these dynamics in the model. Again, it'll be challenging to bring those down to a very granular level. It would sort of probably more be different actor groups. But yeah, it's certainly an area that I think is lacking in most modelling, where it doesn't really, specify the specific role and the trade-offs for different actors that go beyond these sorts of indicators. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. I'm just wondering, even at an aggregate level, would it be possible to show that for these different social groups or for particular industrial sectors, how their economic inputs, for instance, or benefits increase or decrease under different scenarios? Because that will already indicate where potential resistance might come from.
Yeah, absolutely. We can see that. And I think, that's when we, some of the projections that I showed looking at income, for example. So, there's obvious trade-offs. If you want to fund a more ambitious policy agenda that requires tax reforms, and, that's a highly politically sensitive and socially sensitive area. So there's going to be a lot of resistance around that, which is why we desperately need tax reforms in Australia, but no one wants to go near them because they're sort of too hard. So, some of these policies that are in the model would be quite easy to implement, and some of them would be very hard to implement. And they're things we sort of unpack a bit, I guess, in the transformation storylines. But yeah, I think it's it's a real challenge in getting these sorts of things across the line.
Thanks a lot, Cameron, for that. Shireen, I think you're raising your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just as we have a couple of minutes, I thought I might actually pick up on Tony's question, because I think that is really critical. In the end, we're doing all of this with the hope that it will be adopted and used and form the basis of policies. Cameron, I wanted to, if you could talk a little bit about, not within just the Australian context, but more internationally, what is happening in this space? What is the kind of reception towards these models? And earlier this week, you and I talked about what the UNDP, for example, is doing in some countries, Indonesia, in our own region in particular, really looking at these scenarios and accelerators and pathways. So what is the potential for really introducing something like this in our own region, but also more globally, generally?
Yeah, well, thanks, Shireen. I mean, this model is highly adaptable to different countries. It's been applied in several countries since I published the paper in 2019 in Nature Sustainability. A lot of European countries have now taken it up. So interestingly, developed countries are using it. There's a number of national applications in Sweden, in Germany, in France, the Netherlands, etc. Also, there's been applications for countries in Africa. We did a study in Fiji as well, for example. Yeah, I think, the Millennium Institute has been doing, working with various countries, often funded through the UN and donors, to do this sort of modelling. I guess the challenge is that it's quite resource intensive, and these are not sort of quick studies to calibrate the model for countries. It requires a lot of data collection and calibration, and that requires funding and a donor or a partner willing to sort of fund that work. Yeah, the Millennium Institute's also looking at, they've sort of developed machine learning or, AI approaches to try to collect that data and run an initial calibration. So they're sort of testing this approach where they can calibrate the model for 30 countries at once, sort of use coding to do that, to sort of speed up the process and become less resource intensive. But, the UNDP has got its own projects as well. They're using a small CGE type model. There's obviously a lot of different types of models out there. it covers maybe 5 goals or something like that, whereas this model covers all 17 and all of the SDGs. So it's the only model really that has the breadth of coverage of the SDGs. But, you know, there's always trade-offs between using different models. So I think there's a lot of scope for this to be done. One of the other challenges is that the SDGs end in 2030. So if you're running long-term projections, 6 years is not a very long-term time frame to look at changes in policies and drivers. So I think, you know, if we extend that time frame to 2050, for example, it really opens up a lot more opportunities to do this sort of work. I think it's a logical next step. A lot of countries have been localizing the SDGs, setting their own targets, etc. There's not a lot of interest in Australia, but I wouldn't say that's the case in other countries. I think particularly in the developing world, countries really are, you know, have incorporated these targets into their national development plans. And these tools can really start to help them prioritize and sequence their investments. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there.
Thank you, Shurin, for the question, and Cameron for your answer, but particularly also for your entire presentation, of course, and being so patiently addressing all of our questions. That was excellent. I would like to thank everyone also in the audience for sticking with us to 2 minutes over time, and I wish everyone a great day for the rest of the day. Thanks again, Cameron.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks everyone for coming along.